My name is Lena Carter. I'm 29 years old. 3 weeks ago, I walked into my own engagement party and watched my sister kiss my fiancé. Not a friendly kiss on the cheek, not a drunken mistake. A slow, deliberate kiss, right in the middle of my parents' living room, while 25 guests stood around holding champagne glasses. And the worst part? Everyone acted like I was the problem for being upset. But here's the thing my sister didn't know when she stole my fiancé that night. She thought she was taking the best thing in my life. She had no idea she had just stepped into a trap I'd been building for 2 years. Before I tell you what happened next, let me introduce myself properly. Like I said, my name is Lena Carter. I'm the oldest daughter in a family that prides itself on appearances. My parents live in a large colonial house outside Chicago. White pillars, perfectly trimmed hedges, the kind of place that looks like it belongs in a real estate magazine. My father, Richard Carter, owns a mid-sized construction company. My mother, Diane, spends most of her time organizing charity luncheons and reminding everyone that our family has a reputation to maintain. And then there's my sister, Emily Carter. Emily is 3 years younger than me, and if you asked anyone in my family, they'd say she's the star of the show. Blonde, charming, the kind of person who walks into a room and immediately pulls everyone's attention toward her like gravity. Growing up, everything seemed to orbit around Emily. Her dance recitals, her birthday parties, her college send-off, dinner. Even when something good happened to me, somehow Emily still became the center of the conversation. For example, when I graduated with my accounting degree, my parents took us out to dinner to celebrate. Halfway through dessert, my mother raised her glass and said, "This is wonderful, Lena, but let's not forget Emily just got accepted into the marketing program at Northwestern." Everyone applauded. My graduation dinner became Emily's celebration. Moments like that used to bother me. Eventually, I stopped expecting anything different. That's the thing about growing up as the background character in your own family. You learn to stay quiet, you learn to make yourself small, and most importantly, you learn to observe. I work as a financial analyst for a logistics firm in Chicago. It's not glamorous work, but it pays well, and it taught me something very valuable. Numbers don't lie, people do. Which brings us to Daniel. Daniel Brooks walked into my life 4 years ago at a networking event downtown. He was tall, confident, with the kind of smile that made people instantly trust him. He worked in venture capital, or at least that's what he said. We started dating within weeks. At first, everything seemed perfect. Daniel brought flowers to my apartment. He planned surprise weekend trips. He told me I was the most intelligent woman he'd ever met. After 2 years, he proposed during a sunset dinner on Lake Michigan. My parents adored him. My mother practically floated around the house telling everyone her daughter was marrying such a successful young man. Emily liked him too. Actually, that's not quite accurate. Emily didn't just like Daniel, she was fascinated by him. At first I ignored it, the way she'd laugh a little too loudly at his jokes, the way she'd find excuses to touch his arm during conversations, the way she'd show up at family dinners wearing dresses that looked suspiciously like they belonged at a nightclub instead of a Sunday meal. I told myself I was imagining things, because the alternative, that my own sister was flirting with my fiancé, was too ugly to consider. But about 6 months before our wedding, I started noticing something strange. Daniel's finances didn't add up. Remember what I said earlier? Numbers don't lie. People do. Daniel often talked about investment deals and venture capital profits. But whenever he mentioned specific numbers, something felt off, too vague, too polished. One evening while he was in the shower at my apartment, his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Normally, I would never look. But the screen lit up with a notification that caught my attention. Final notice, payment overdue. From a credit company. My stomach tightened. Curiosity won. I opened the message. And in less than 10 seconds, my entire life shifted. Daniel Brooks, the successful venture capitalist my family adored, was drowning in debt. Not small debt. Over $240,000 in personal loans and credit lines, late payments, collections notices, legal warnings. I remember sitting there at my kitchen table staring at his phone while the shower water ran in the background, trying to understand how the man who claimed to manage million-dollar investments couldn't even pay his own credit cards. That's when the second message appeared, from Emily, my sister. "Dinner tomorrow night? Just us. Don't tell Lena." My heart stopped. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. Not because I was surprised, because suddenly everything made sense. The flirting, the late-night texts, the way Emily always seemed just a little too comfortable around my fiancé. But here's the part that changed everything. Instead of confronting them, I did something else. Something my sister never saw coming. I smiled. Because in that moment, I realized something incredibly important. Emily thought she was stealing my fiancé, but the truth was, she was about to inherit all of his problems. And I was going to make sure she did it publicly. But to explain how that happened, I need to tell you about the engagement party, the night everything exploded, and the moment my sister thought she had finally won. The engagement party was my mother's idea. Of course it was. If my mom had her way, every life event would come with a catered buffet, crystal glasses, and at least 30 people pretending our family was perfectly happy. She insisted we hosted at my parents' house, the big white colonial with the sweeping staircase and the chandelier that she loved reminding people was imported from Italy. By the time the party started that evening, the living room looked like something out of a bridal magazine. Soft music played in the background. A long table held trays of appetizers. Champagne glasses clinked while guests chatted about wedding plans. On the surface, everything looked perfect. But inside, I felt strangely calm. Because for the past 3 weeks, I had been quietly preparing for this night. After discovering Daniel's debt and the secret messages with Emily, I didn't confront either of them. I didn't cry. I didn't accuse. Instead, I did what I always do. I observed, and the more I watched, the clearer everything became. Daniel started spending more time texting. Emily suddenly became very interested in helping with wedding planning. Sometimes I would walk into a room and the two of them would stop talking immediately. Other times I would catch them exchanging glances they thought no one noticed. But I noticed. Every single time. A week after I saw those messages, on Daniel's phone, I met with someone during my lunch break. A lawyer, not for a breakup, for something far more interesting. You see, my job as a financial analyst comes with a few useful skills. One of them is knowing how to read contracts. Another is knowing how to design them. So when Daniel proposed, 6 months earlier, I had suggested something that my parents thought was incredibly responsible. A prenup. My father was thrilled. "Smart girl," he said at the time. "Always protect your assets." Daniel had laughed and signed it without reading very carefully. That was his first mistake. Because buried inside that prenup were clauses most people wouldn't bother examining closely. Clauses about shared liabilities, clauses about marital financial disclosure, and most importantly, clauses about fraud. At the time, Daniel assumed it was just legal paperwork. But once I discovered his debt and the lies about his finances, that document became very valuable. Because legally speaking, if someone enters a marriage while concealing massive financial liabilities, the contract shifts responsibility in ways that can be unpleasant, especially if another party knowingly benefits from that deception. And guess who had been secretly helping Daniel hide things? Emily. I didn't know how deep their relationship had gone yet, but I suspected enough, which is why I made one small adjustment to the evening's schedule. Right around 8:30 p.m., my father planned to make a toast to celebrate the engagement. That part was normal. What wasn't normal was the guest list I quietly expanded, because 2 additional people would be arriving, my lawyer, and someone from Daniel's bank. Neither Daniel nor Emily knew they were coming. By the time the party was in full swing, the house buzzed with conversation. My mother floated between guests with a proud smile. Daniel stood near the bar telling one of my father's colleagues about a new investment opportunity. Emily lingered nearby, laughing at everything he said. Watching them together was almost surreal. It was like observing actors who didn't realize the stage lights were about to turn on. At one point, Emily walked over to me with a glass of champagne. "You must be so excited," she said sweetly. Her smile looked perfect. Too perfect. I smiled back. "I am." She leaned closer. "You really got lucky with Daniel." I held her gaze. "Did I?" For a split second, something flickered in her eyes. Then she laughed. Across the room, Daniel was watching us. He quickly looked away. I checked the time on my phone. 8:27 p.m. Almost time. 3 minutes later, my father tapped a spoon against his glass. "Everyone, if I could have your attention." The room quieted. Guests gathered near the staircase as my father raised his champagne. We're here tonight to celebrate the upcoming marriage of my daughter Lena and this fine young man, Daniel. Polite applause filled the room. Daniel wrapped an arm around my shoulders. Emily stood only a few feet away, smiling. Then my father nodded toward me. Lena, why don't you say a few words? Perfect. I stepped forward, holding my champagne glass. For a moment, I let the room settle. 25 guests, family friends, colleagues, neighbors, and right behind them, 2 people who had just quietly entered the house, my lawyer and the bank representative. Neither Daniel nor Emily noticed them yet. I took a breath. First, I said calmly, I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. Smiles around the room. I also want to thank Daniel. He squeezed my shoulder. For teaching me something very important about trust. That line made a few people chuckle. Daniel smiled confidently. Then I continued. You see, when Daniel proposed, we signed a prenuptial agreement. A few guests nodded approvingly. Most people think prenups are just about protecting money, I said, but sometimes they protect something even more important. Daniel's smile faded slightly. I turned slowly toward him. The truth. The room grew quiet. Emily shifted where she stood. Daniel laughed awkwardly. Babe, what are you talking about? I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder. Inside were printed documents, statements, debt notices, legal disclosures. I held them up. These are Daniel's financial records. The silence in the room deepened instantly. Daniel's face went pale. Emily stopped smiling. Apparently, I continued calmly, my fiancé forgot to mention something before proposing. I opened the folder. About $240,000 in personal debt. Gasps rippled through the guests. Daniel grabbed my arm. Lena, I stepped back. Oh, we're not done yet. Then I looked directly at my sister. Because Emily knew about it too. Her face turned white, and she helped him hide it. Someone in the room whispered, What? Daniel looked stunned. Emily shook her head quickly. That's not... But I wasn't finished. Because the next thing I revealed would make the entire room freeze. Emily stared at me like the floor had just disappeared beneath her. For the first time in her life, she didn't have a clever smile ready. Lena, what are you talking about? She said, her voice suddenly thin. Daniel stepped forward quickly. This is crazy. She's misunderstanding something. But the room was already shifting. Guests who had been laughing minutes earlier were now whispering. My mother looked confused. My father's expression hardened the way it did when someone lied during a business negotiation. I held the folder in my hands calmly. I'm not misunderstanding anything, I said. Then I turned slightly so everyone could see the papers. These are statements from 3 different banks. Credit cards, personal loans, and a line of credit Daniel opened last year. Daniel's face had gone completely pale. You went through my phone? He snapped. I smiled slightly. No, I said. I went through public records. That was partially true. Once I had seen the first message on his phone weeks earlier, I did what any financial analyst would do. I started digging. Bankruptcy filings, loan records, business registrations, everything tied to Daniel Brooks. What I found was worse than I expected. Not only was Daniel buried in debt, most of the investment deals he bragged about didn't exist. He wasn't a venture capitalist. He was a freelance consultant who occasionally flipped small tech stocks. The big lifestyle he pretended to have? It was all financed with borrowed money. And the plan had been simple. Marry me, join my family, gain access to my father's business network, and eventually, the Carter family money. But Daniel made one critical mistake. He underestimated how much I paid attention. And Emily made an even bigger mistake. She thought she could outplay me. I looked directly at her now. You started meeting Daniel privately about 4 months ago, I said. Her mouth opened. No, I didn't. You met him at Café Belmont on March 3rd, I continued calmly. Then again on March 12th. And April 2nd. Her face drained of color. Because those meetings were real. She knew it. Daniel knew it. and now everyone in the room knew it too. How would you even know that? She whispered. That's when I gestured toward the two people standing quietly near the back of the room. My lawyer helped confirm a few things, I said. Several guests turned to look. The bank representative stepped forward slightly, and so did Daniel's primary lender. Now the whispers in the room grew louder. Daniel suddenly looked furious. You had no right? Oh, I had every right, I said calmly. Then I turned toward the guests again. Because when someone proposes marriage while hiding massive financial liabilities, that counts as fraudulent disclosure under the prenup. My father's eyebrows rose slightly. Now he was paying very close attention. I continued. The agreement Daniel signed 6 months ago contains a clause that protects me from assuming any concealed debts. Daniel looked like he wanted to grab the papers out of my hands. But that's not the interesting part, I added. The room had gone completely silent now. Even the music had stopped. I slowly closed the folder. The interesting part, I said, is that the clause also applies to anyone who knowingly helps conceal those debts for personal gain. Emily blinked. What? Now several guests were staring at her. I tilted my head slightly. You didn't read the document Daniel signed, did you? Her voice trembled. Why would I? Exactly. She thought she was just stealing my fiancé. She had no idea she had stepped into a legal nightmare. I looked back toward the lawyer. He gave a small nod. That was the signal. Emily, I said softly, when you helped Daniel move money between accounts last month to hide those overdue payments. Her eyes widened instantly. You unknowingly became part of the financial deception. The room exploded, with whispers. My mother gasped. My father stepped forward slowly. Emily, he said sharply, tell me that isn't true. Emily looked completely panicked now. I didn't know anything about that. Daniel turned toward her, suddenly desperate. Don't say anything! That was the moment everything cracked, because in that instant, everyone could see the truth. The secret meetings, the lies, the betrayal. And Emily realized something terrifying. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This had legal consequences. She looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. You planned this, she whispered. I shrugged slightly. No, I said calmly. I just paid attention. Then Daniel made the worst decision he could possibly make. He laughed, a loud, mocking laugh. You think this changes anything? He said. The wedding's in 3 weeks. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Then he looked straight at me. You're not actually going to cancel it over some paperwork. That's when I smiled, because Daniel still didn't understand what was happening. Neither did Emily, so I said the one sentence that made the entire room freeze. There isn't going to be a wedding. Daniel frowned. What? I slipped the engagement ring off my finger and placed it on the table beside the champagne. Glasses. I called it off 2 weeks ago. The silence that followed felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Daniel's face went blank. Emily blinked. What do you mean? She said. I looked directly at her. It means, I said calmly, you're welcome to have him. A few guests gasped, because they suddenly understood what I meant. Daniel was no longer marrying into the Carter family, which meant the money, the connections, the safety net, all gone. And the only person still standing beside him was Emily, my sister, the one who thought she had won. Daniel turned toward her slowly. For the first time all night, he looked unsure. Emily looked back at him, and suddenly, neither of them seemed very happy. But what happened 2 days later made the entire situation even worse for them. Because Daniel's biggest secret still hadn't come out yet, and when it did, Emily realized she had made the worst mistake of her life. 2 days after the engagement party, my phone rang at 7:14 in the morning. I was sitting in my kitchen, with a cup of coffee, finally enjoying the quiet after the chaos of that night. When I looked at the caller ID, I almost laughed. Emily. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won. I answered. Hello? Her voice sounded completely different from the confident tone she had used at the party. Small, panicked. Lena, we need to talk. I leaned back in my chair. That's interesting, I said calmly. 2 days ago, you seemed pretty busy kissing my fiancé in front of half the city. She inhaled sharply. It's not like that. Really? Silence. Then she whispered, Daniel is in serious trouble. I stared at the wall for a moment, so it had started. What kind of trouble? I asked. Her voice shook. Legal trouble. Of course. I had suspected that might happen, but I wanted to hear her say it. Explain. Emily rushed through the words. Apparently, the bank representative at the party filed a report after seeing the documents. They started reviewing Daniel's accounts yesterday. I closed my eyes for a moment, exactly as expected. And? I asked. They think he falsified loan applications. There it was. Fraud. Daniel's mountain of debt wasn't just embarrassing. Some of it had been obtained by lying about income and investment assets. Banks take that very seriously. So what does that have to do with me? I asked. Emily's voice cracked. They think I helped him. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. How? Daniel asked me to transfer money between accounts a few times, she said quickly. He told me it was just temporary stuff for an investment deal. I remembered the moment at the party when I mentioned that. Her face had gone white, because she suddenly realized the truth. She hadn't been helping a brilliant investor. She had been helping someone cover financial holes. And now they think I was part of it, she whispered. I stirred my coffee slowly. That must be stressful. Lena, please, she said. You know I didn't mean for any of this to happen. That sentence hung in the air. Didn't mean for it to happen. Not the betrayal, not the deception, not the consequences. Just like when we were kids. Emily had always believed that intentions erased actions, but real life doesn't work that way. Why are you calling me? I asked. Because you started this, she said. Ah, there it was. Blame. You exposed him, she continued. If you hadn't done that at the party, none of this would be happening. I smiled slightly. No, Emily, I said calmly. This was happening the moment you decided to secretly date your sister's fiancé. Silence. Then she said something that surprised me. I'm not dating him. That made me pause. What? We weren't together, she said quietly. Now I was confused, because that kiss at the party had looked very convincing. What were you then? I asked. Her answer came slowly. He told me you were planning to leave him. Interesting. He said you were cold and distant, that the wedding was only happening because of your parents. I almost laughed. So he told you I didn't love him? Yes. And that made it okay to go behind my back? Another silence. Finally, she whispered, I thought he needed someone who actually cared about him. For a moment, I just sat there. Emily, the girl who had always chased attention, had fallen for the oldest manipulation trick in the book. Daniel hadn't seduced her. He had recruited her, a sympathetic ally, someone close to me, someone who could help him move money and gain trust inside the family, and she walked straight into it. Emily, I said quietly. Yes? You weren't his girlfriend. What? You were his backup plan. Her breathing stopped. Daniel's original strategy had been obvious. Marry me, gain access to my father's network and financial stability. But if that failed? Emily was the alternative. Someone easier to manipulate, someone eager to prove she mattered, which meant one thing. The moment Daniel realized I had exposed him, he would switch sides instantly. Where is Daniel right now? I asked. Her voice trembled. He left this morning. Left? He packed a bag and said he needed space. Of course he did. Daniel wasn't loyal to anyone. Not me, not Emily, not even himself. He was loyal to opportunity. And right now, both of us had become liabilities. Emily, I said. Yes? If I were you, I'd call a lawyer. Her voice cracked. Lena, please. Can you talk to your lawyer for me? There it was again. The assumption that I would clean up her mess, just like I had my whole life. But this time was different. Emily, I said calmly, for once, you're going to have to solve your own problems. And then I hung up. I wish I could say that was the end of the story, but it wasn't. Because later that week, something happened that shocked everyone, even me. Daniel Brooks disappeared. Not emotionally, not socially, legally. And when the truth about his debts finally surfaced, Emily realized she hadn't just stolen the wrong man. She had almost tied herself to a financial disaster that could have followed her for the rest of her life. But the moment that truly broke my family came 3 weeks later, at a dinner my parents insisted on hosting, because that was the night my father said something to Emily that none of us expected. 3 weeks after the engagement party, my mother insisted we all come over for dinner. According to her, the family needed to heal. My mother has always believed that problems disappear if you put them in a dining room with good china and a roast chicken. Real life is rarely that cooperative. When I arrived at my parents' house that evening, the atmosphere felt heavy. Not tense exactly, just quiet. The kind of quiet that happens after everyone already knows the truth. My father was sitting at the head of the table reading something on his tablet. My mother moved nervously between the kitchen and dining room, adjusting plates that were already perfectly aligned, and Emily was already there. I barely recognized her. 3 weeks earlier, she had looked confident, glowing even. Now she looked exhausted. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. The confident posture she always carried had disappeared. For the first time in my life, Emily looked small. She glanced up when I walked in. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then she looked away. Dinner started quietly. My mother tried to keep conversation flowing. "How is work going, Lena?" "Busy," I replied. "That's good. Staying productive is important." Then she turned to Emily. "And you, sweetheart?" Emily pushed food around her plate. "Fine." The word hung there awkwardly. Everyone knew it wasn't true, because during those 3 weeks, a lot had happened. Daniel hadn't just disappeared socially. He had vanished completely. Phone disconnected, apartment empty, job apparently non-existent. When banks started digging into his finances after the engagement party exposure, they uncovered something even worse than debt. Daniel had been using fabricated investment claims to secure multiple personal loans. In simple terms, he had lied about assets he didn't actually own. Once the investigation started, he ran. The banks were now looking for him. And unfortunately for Emily, her name had appeared in several transactions moving money between accounts. She hadn't committed fraud intentionally, but she had helped Daniel move funds while he was hiding overdue balances, which meant lawyers were now involved, and Emily had spent the past 2 weeks terrified. Halfway through dinner, my father finally set down his tablet. "Emily," he said calmly. She froze. "Yes?" "Your lawyer called me yesterday." Her fork clinked against her plate. "He did?" My father nodded. "He wanted clarification about your involvement in Daniel's financial transfers." Emily's voice shook. "I told him I didn't know anything." My father leaned back in his chair. "I believe you." That seemed to surprise her. "But believing you doesn't change the situation," he continued. Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." My mother reached across the table. "Oh, honey." But my father raised a hand gently. "Emily," he said, "look at me." She slowly lifted her head. There was no anger in my father's face, just something much heavier. Disappointment. "You didn't just make a mistake," he said quietly. "You ignored every warning sign because you wanted attention." Emily's lip trembled. "That's not—" "You knew Daniel was Lena's fiancé," he continued. "You knew meeting him secretly was wrong." Tears started rolling down her cheeks. "But I thought that you were special," my father finished. The words landed hard. Emily covered her mouth. My father wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. Sometimes calm truth hurts more than anger. "For years," he continued, You've assumed life would always protect you from consequences. The room was silent. Then he said the sentence none of us expected. That stops now. Emily blinked through tears. What do you mean? My father folded his hands on the table. It means your legal situation is your responsibility. My mother looked shocked. Richard, no, he said gently. This is important. Then he looked directly at Emily. I will not interfere with the investigation. Her face went pale. You're not going to help me? I will support you emotionally, he said, but I will not use my influence or money to erase this. Emily looked like the ground had opened beneath her. But you've helped Lena before. That made my father glance at me briefly, then back to her. Yes, he said, because Lena has never asked me to clean up a mess she created. The silence that followed felt enormous. Emily's shoulders started shaking. I didn't know he was lying, she whispered. I believe you, my father said again, but the world doesn't run on intentions. He stood up slowly. Actions have consequences. Emily stared at her plate, crying quietly. For the first time in our lives, no one rushed to protect her. Dinner ended shortly after that. As I grabbed my coat to leave, Emily stopped me near the front door. Lena, she said softly. I turned. Her eyes were red. I'm sorry. The words sounded fragile, not dramatic, not manipulative, just tired. For a moment, I studied her face. The sister who had spent years competing with me. The girl who always believed she had won, until now. I know, I said quietly. She looked surprised. You do? Yes. Then I added something she probably didn't expect. But apologies don't fix consequences. She nodded slowly. I understand. For the first time in a long time. I think she actually did. As I stepped outside, the cool night air felt strangely peaceful. The wedding that was supposed to happen in 3 weeks was gone. Daniel had vanished. Emily was dealing with lawyers. And my family would probably never look quite the same again. But something inside me felt lighter. Because for the first time, I wasn't the background character in my own story anymore. And the strange thing is, losing my fiancé that night turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. Because 6 months later, something unexpected happened that changed my life completely. But that is a story for another time. 6 months later, I was sitting in a quiet coffee shop on a rainy Thursday morning when my phone buzzed. It was my mother. For a second, I considered ignoring it. The past few months had been peaceful, and I had learned to enjoy mornings without family drama. But I answered anyway. Hi, Mom. Her voice sounded unusually excited. You need to come over tonight. I frowned slightly. Why? There was a pause. Emily's coming to dinner. That alone wasn't surprising, but then my mother added something that made me sit up straight. And she's bringing someone. Now that was unexpected. Emily had spent the last 6 months rebuilding her life. After the investigation cleared her of intentional wrongdoing, she moved out of her old apartment, started therapy, and quietly started over. She wasn't the same person anymore. The loud, attention-seeking version of my sister had disappeared. In her place was someone calmer, quieter. So hearing that she was bringing someone to dinner was interesting. Who? I asked. I think you'll like him, my mom said mysteriously. That was never reassuring. Still, that evening I drove to my parents' house again, the same house where the engagement party had exploded months earlier. Walking through the front door felt strangely nostalgic. The chandelier still sparkled above the staircase. The dining table was set exactly the way my mother always arranged it. Some things never change. My father was already seated in the living room reading. He looked up and smiled slightly. Evening, Lena. Hi, Dad. Big night, apparently, he said. I heard. We both knew what he meant. A few minutes later, headlights appeared through the front window. My mother peeked through. The curtain. That must be them. The front door opened. Emily stepped inside first. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize her again, but this time in a good way. She looked healthy, relaxed. Her posture was confident again, but not in the old performative way. More grounded. Then someone stepped in behind her, a tall man with dark hair and an easy smile. Emily turned to him. "This is my family." He nodded politely. "Nice to meet all of you." Emily took a breath. "This is Mark." My father stood and shook his hand. "Richard Carter." "Pleasure to meet you, sir." Something about the interaction felt natural. No tension, no performance. Just normal human conversation, which in our family was a refreshing change. Dinner started soon after. The conversation flowed easily. Mark turned out to be an architect who had recently moved to the city for a new project. He and Emily had met through a volunteer program. She started attending after therapy. He was calm, thoughtful, and refreshingly honest. At one point, he said something that made the entire table go quiet. "Emily told me about what happened last year," he said. Emily looked embarrassed. "I didn't tell him everything," she added quickly. Mark shrugged lightly. Enough to understand that she went through something really difficult. Emily looked down at her plate. 6 months ago, she would have tried to control the narrative. Now she simply let the truth exist. My father studied Mark carefully. Then he asked, "And that didn't scare you off?" Mark smiled slightly. "Actually, it made me respect her more." Emily looked up. "Why?" He answered simply, "Because she owned her mistakes. No excuses, no blaming others, just honesty." For a moment, the entire room was quiet again. Then my father nodded slowly. "Well," he said, "that's a rare quality." My mother wiped the corner of her eye discreetly. Later that night, after dinner ended, Emily walked me out to my car. We stood in the driveway under the soft glow of the porch light. "So," she said nervously, "what do you think?" I leaned against my car door. "He seems good for you." She smiled faintly. "That's what my therapist says." That made me laugh. Then she looked at me seriously. "I know I don't deserve it," she said, "but I'm really trying to be better." For a moment, I just watched her. 6 months earlier, she had been drowning in consequences of her own choices. Now she was rebuilding, slowly, honestly. "That's all anyone can do," I said. She nodded. Then she hesitated. "There's something else." "What?" She smiled slightly. "You never told me what happened to Daniel." I opened my car door. "You don't want to know?" Her curiosity immediately kicked in. "Yes, I do." I paused. Then I said something that made her eyes widen. "They found him." Emily blinked. "Where?" I shrugged casually. "Working at a car dealership in Arizona." Her mouth opened. "What happened to all his investment deals?" "Turns out," I said, "they were never real." For a moment, she stared at me. Then she burst out laughing. Not the old sarcastic laugh, a real one. "Wow," she said. "Guess we both dodged a bullet." I got into my car and started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rear view mirror. Emily was standing in the driveway smiling. And for the first time in a very long time, it didn't feel like we were competing anymore. It felt like we were finally just sisters again. And strangely enough, that might have been the happiest ending either of us ever expected. 6 months passed quietly after that dinner. Life settled into something normal again. Emily kept seeing Mark. My parents slowly relaxed. The chaos that Daniel had brought into our lives faded into a strange story we occasionally joked about. And I focused on my own life. Work was going well. I had started consulting for a new financial firm. I traveled more. I spent time with friends I had ignored while planning a wedding that was never meant to happen. For the first time in years, I wasn't building my life around someone else. And honestly, it felt good. Then one afternoon in early spring, something unexpected happened. I was leaving my office building when I heard someone say my name. "Lena?" I turned around, and for a moment I thought my brain had made a mistake. Because standing across the sidewalk was Daniel. He looked different. Gone was the expensive suit and polished confidence he used to wear like armor. Now he wore a wrinkled dress shirt and a cheap jacket. His hair was shorter, his face thinner. And his expression, the cocky smirk that once fooled so many people, had disappeared. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he gave a small, awkward smile. "Hi." I crossed my arms. "Well," I said calmly, "Arizona must not have been very exciting." His smile faltered. "So you heard?" "Yes." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I wasn't expecting to see you." "I wasn't expecting to see you either," I replied. There was an uncomfortable pause. Then he said something that surprised me. "I wanted to apologize." That made me raise an eyebrow. "For which part?" I asked. "The lying, the cheating, or the attempted financial fraud?" He winced. "Yeah, I deserve that." For a moment, he looked down at the sidewalk. "I messed up," he said quietly. That might have been the first honest sentence I had ever heard him say. But honesty doesn't erase consequences. "What do you want, Daniel?" I asked. "Nothing," he said quickly. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry." I studied him carefully. 6 months ago, he had been charming, confident, and manipulative. Now he looked like a man who had finally met reality. "What happened to you?" I asked. He laughed softly. "A lot." Apparently, after the investigation started, he fled to Arizona thinking he could start over. But banks don't forget about money. Debt collectors eventually caught up. The investment lifestyle disappeared quickly when no one was lending him cash anymore. Now he worked at a small dealership selling used cars. No luxury dinners. No big promises, just commission sales and overdue loan payments. "Turns out," he said quietly, "running away doesn't fix anything." "No, it never does." He looked at me again. "You were right about me." I didn't respond, because there wasn't much to say. Then he asked something that almost made me laugh. "Are you seeing anyone?" I shook my head slowly. "Daniel, even if I were the last person on earth." He raised his hands. "Fair enough." For a moment, we just stood there. Two people who once planned a wedding. Now strangers standing on a sidewalk. Then he nodded. "Well, I guess that's it." He started to walk away, but after a few steps, he stopped and said one last thing without turning around. "You deserved better." Then he disappeared into the crowd. I stood there for a moment thinking about everything that had happened. The lies, the betrayal, the chaos, and how close I had come to marrying someone who would have destroyed my life. Then my phone buzzed. It was a text from Emily. "Emily, Mark just proposed." I blinked, then smiled. A second message arrived. "Emily, don't worry. We actually read the prenup this time." I laughed out loud. Standing there on the sidewalk, I realized something strange. A year ago, my life had looked perfect on the outside. The fiancé, the wedding, the future everyone expected. But it was all built on lies. Now, everything was messy, unpredictable, real, and somehow much better. Because sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is actually the thing that saves you. And the engagement party that was supposed to celebrate my future marriage ended up saving my future entirely. A year after the engagement party, life looked completely different. The strange thing about time is how quickly chaos turns into memory. The scandal, the investigation, Daniel disappearing, all of it slowly became one of those stories people only brought up occasionally. But the ripple effects were still shaping our lives. One Saturday afternoon, my phone buzzed again. "Emily," I answered immediately. "Hey." Her voice sounded excited. "You busy?" "Not really. Why?" "You need to come see something." I laughed. That sentence has never ended calmly in our family. "Just come," she said. "Trust me." So an hour Later, I drove across town to the small house she and Mark had recently bought. It was modest. Nothing like the huge home she once dreamed of showing off on social media, but it was warm. Real. Emily opened the door before I even knocked. "You're here." She pulled me inside quickly. Mark was in the living room assembling something on the floor. When he saw me, he grinned. Perfect timing. I looked between them. "What's going on?" Emily grabbed my hand. "Okay, don't freak out." That sentence is universally known as the worst possible introduction to news. "What did you do?" I asked cautiously. She took a deep breath. "We're having a baby." For a moment, my brain paused. Then I stared at her. "Wait, seriously?" She nodded. Mark held up a tiny pair of baby shoes he had just been unpacking. The room suddenly felt warm with excitement. I laughed and hugged her. Wow. Emily's eyes filled with happy tears. I know. 6 months earlier, she had been drowning in legal stress and guilt. Now she was starting a family. Life moves in strange directions sometimes. We spent the next hour talking about names, doctor visits, and nursery ideas. At one point, Emily sat down next to me on the couch. "You know something?" she said. "What? If that engagement party never happened, my life would be completely different." I nodded. "Mine too." She looked thoughtful. "For a long time, I hated that night." "Understandable," I said, "but now, I think it saved me." That surprised me. "How?" She smiled faintly. "Because it forced me to become someone better." That was true. Without the consequences, Emily might never have changed. Sometimes the hardest moments in life are the ones that redirect us. Later that evening, I left their house and walked to my car. As I unlocked the door, my phone buzzed again. This time it was my father. "Dad. Dinner tomorrow?" I smiled. Me. "Of course." Then he sent another message. "Dad. Also, proud of both of you girls." I stared at the screen for a moment. My father wasn't a man who expressed emotions often. So when he did, it meant something. A year earlier, our family had nearly shattered, but somehow we had rebuilt something stronger. Not perfect, but honest. And that made all the difference. As I drove home that night, I realized something important. The engagement party that once felt like the worst night of my life had actually been the turning point for all of us. Emily found the right person. My parents stopped pretending everything was perfect. And I learned something that changed the way I looked at relationships forever. Sometimes the person who breaks your heart is actually the person who saves your future. And if I could go back in time and stop that party from happening, I wouldn't change a single thing. 2 years after the engagement party, I was sitting at my parents' dining table again. The same table where everything had fallen apart that night. But this time, the atmosphere was completely different. There were baby toys on the floor, a stroller by the wall, and my niece, Emily and Mark's daughter, Sophie, was sitting in a high chair enthusiastically throwing pieces of banana onto the table. Emily sighed. "See, this is why people stop posting cute baby photos after the first 6 months." Mark laughed from the kitchen. "She's just exploring gravity." My mother scooped Sophie up immediately. "Oh, no, you don't, little scientist." The room filled with laughter. If someone had walked into the house 2 years earlier during the engagement party disaster, they would never believe this was the same family. Everything felt lighter now. Real. No pretending. No competition. Just people who had finally learned how fragile life actually is. My father sat across from me sipping coffee. "So," he said, "how's the new job?" "It's good," I said. "Busy." That was an understatement. Over the past year, my consulting work had grown into something bigger than I expected. I had started advising small businesses about financial transparency and risk management. Ironically, Daniel's financial chaos had become a strange kind of case study. Turns out a lot of companies needed help avoiding the same mistakes. My father nodded approvingly. "You turned a bad situation into something useful." I guess I did. Emily walked over with Sophie in her arms. "You definitely did," she said. Then she looked at me with a playful grin. "And you still haven't told us about that guy." My mother immediately turned around. "What guy?" I groaned. Emily. What? She said innocently. You've been texting someone for weeks. Now my mother looked delighted. Oh, really? Mark laughed quietly. I shook my head. You people have too much time. But they weren't wrong. About 3 months earlier, I had met someone during a conference in Chicago. His name was Adrian. He was a lawyer who specialized in corporate investigations, the kind of person who spent his career uncovering financial deception, which meant our first conversation had turned into a 2-hour discussion about fraud cases, contracts, and human psychology. Strangely romantic, in a very nerdy way. But after everything I had gone through with Daniel, I had taken things slowly. Very slowly. Emily bounced Sophie on her hip. So when do we meet him? Eventually. My father raised an eyebrow. You're being cautious. Careful, I corrected. He nodded approvingly. Good. Because the truth was, I wasn't afraid of relationships anymore. But I had learned something important. Love should never require ignoring warning signs. Emily leaned closer. Does he know the engagement party story? Yes. And? I smiled. He said it sounded like the plot of a movie. Mark laughed. He's not wrong. Sophie suddenly clapped her hands loudly. Everyone turned toward her. My mother smiled warmly. Well, she said, if nothing else, that disaster eventually gave us this little girl. Emily kissed Sophie's forehead. That's the best outcome we could have asked for. For a moment, we all sat quietly, thinking about how close everything had come to collapsing, and how strange it was that something so painful had ultimately led to something better. Later that night, after dinner ended, I stepped outside to get some fresh air. The porch light cast a warm glow over the driveway, the same driveway where Emily and I had that difficult conversation the night everything changed. My phone buzzed. It was Adrian. Adrian. Still surviving family dinner? I smiled. Me. Barely. A moment later, he replied, Adrian. Worth it? I looked back through the window. Inside, Emily was chasing Sophie around the living room while Mark tried to rescue the houseplant she was attempting to eat. My parents were laughing. The whole scene felt messy and loud and imperfect, but also real. I typed back. Me. Yeah, definitely worth it. Then Adrian sent one more message. Adrian. Good, because I'm coming to meet them next weekend. I stared at the screen for a second, then laughed softly. Looks like another family dinner was about to become interesting. But at least this time, no one was hiding anything. And that made all the difference. The next weekend arrived faster than I expected, and somehow, the entire family already knew about it. Emily had a supernatural ability to spread information before I even finished telling people. When I arrived at my parents' house that evening, the situation was already suspicious. My mother had cooked way too much food. My father had opened a bottle of wine he usually saved for holidays. Emily had somehow managed to arrive early with Mark and Sophie, which meant one thing. This wasn't a casual dinner anymore. This was a family inspection. I walked into the living room and immediately saw Emily smiling at me like she knew something. You nervous? She whispered. No. You should be. Why? Because Dad has questions. Of course he did. My father treated meeting someone new the way CEOs treat interviewing executives. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. The room went quiet. My mother clapped her hands nervously. Oh, that must be him! Everyone looked at me. Relax, I said. Then, I walked to the door and opened it. Adrian stood there holding a small dessert box. He smiled. Backup pastries, he said, in case I need them as a peace offering. I laughed. Smart strategy. When we walked into the living room, the introductions began. Mom, Dad, Emily, Mark, this is Adrian. He shook hands calmly with everyone. My father studied him carefully. Adrian, he said, what do you do again? Corporate investigations, Adrian replied. My father leaned back slightly. Meaning you investigate financial fraud? Mostly. Emily burst out laughing. Oh my God. Adrian looked confused. What? Emily pointed at me. You two are literally the most perfect pair of nerds I've ever seen. Mark chuckled. Honestly, She's not wrong. Dinner started shortly after. And surprisingly, it went well. Adrian handled my father's questions without hesitation. He told funny stories about strange fraud cases. He asked thoughtful questions about Emily and Mark's work. He even helped Sophie stack wooden blocks during dessert. By the end of the night, my mother was already treating him like family. At one point, she leaned over and whispered to me, "I like this one." That was the closest thing to an official approval she ever gave. Later that evening, after dinner ended, Adrian and I stepped outside onto the porch. The cool night air felt quiet after the noisy house. "Well," he said, "I survived. You did better than survive." He smiled. "Your father is intimidating. He liked you." "How can you tell?" "He didn't try to interrogate your childhood." Adrian laughed. "Good sign." We stood there for a moment in comfortable silence. Then he said something that made me pause. "You know, meeting your family tonight made me realize something." "What? That engagement party story you told me?" I raised an eyebrow. "Yes?" "It changed everything." He gestured toward the house. "If that disaster hadn't happened, none of this would exist." He was right. Emily wouldn't have met Mark. Sophie wouldn't exist. I wouldn't have started my new career, and I definitely wouldn't have met Adrian. Funny how life works. Sometimes the moment that feels like everything falling apart is actually everything rearranging itself into something better. I leaned against the porch railing. "You know the strangest part?" I said. "What?" "That night felt like the end of my life." Adrian smiled softly. "And now?" I looked back through the window. Inside, my family was laughing loudly while Sophie tried to climb onto the couch. "Now," I said, "it feels like the beginning." He nodded. "Then I guess Daniel accidentally did you the biggest favor of your life." I laughed. "Don't give him too much credit." Adrian grinned. "Fair." And as we stood there under the porch light, I realized something important. The worst betrayal I had ever experienced had quietly turned into the best turning point of my life. Not because the pain was worth it, but because what came after was better than what I almost settled for. And that's something I'll always be grateful for. 3 years after the engagement party, life had settled into something none of us expected. Not perfect, but real. And that turned out to be better than perfect. One warm summer afternoon, our entire family gathered again at my parents' house. But this time it wasn't for a tense dinner or a dramatic confrontation. It was for Sophie's 3rd birthday party. The backyard was filled with balloons, kids running around, and a ridiculous amount of cake. Emily was chasing Sophie across the lawn while Mark tried to keep the birthday candles from melting in the sun. My mother had gone into full celebration mode. Decorations everywhere, music playing, neighbors invited. My father sat under the patio umbrella watching everything with a quiet smile. I walked over and handed him a drink. "Big difference from 3 years ago," I said. He nodded slowly. "Yes." Neither of us needed to say what we were thinking. 3 years earlier, that same house had hosted the engagement party that nearly tore everything apart. Now it was filled with laughter. Life has a strange sense of irony. Across the yard, Adrian was kneeling on the grass, helping Sophie open presents. She immediately grabbed a stuffed dinosaur and ran straight toward him. "Roar!" Adrian pretended to be terrified. "Oh no, dinosaur attack!" Sophie laughed so hard she almost fell over. Emily looked at me and shook her head. She likes him more than she likes us. "Understandable," I said. "He lets her win every game." Emily smiled. Then she said something quietly. "You know, I still think about that night sometimes." "The engagement party?" She nodded. "For a long time, I thought it ruined everything." I looked around the backyard, Mark laughing with my father, my mother taking pictures of Sophie, Adrian chasing a toddler pretending to be a dinosaur. "Did it?" I asked. Emily smiled softly. "No." She glanced at Sophie. "It actually gave me the life I was supposed to have." That was probably the most honest thing she had ever said. A moment later, Adrian walked over, carrying Sophie on his shoulders. "Excuse me," he said dramatically. The dinosaur demands cake. Sophie raised both hands. Cake! Everyone laughed. My mother clapped her hands. All right, time for candles. The family gathered around the table. Sophie stood in front of the cake while we all sang happy birthday. When she blew out the candles, everyone cheered. Then Adrian leaned toward me quietly. You realize something, right? What? If Daniel hadn't lied, none of us would be here. I thought about that. The lies, the betrayal, the disaster that once felt like the worst moment of my life. And how it somehow led to everything standing in front of me now. Emily's family, my relationship with Adrian, a stronger bond with my parents, a life that felt honest instead of staged. Yeah, I said, I've thought about that too. Adrian smiled. So technically, I raised an eyebrow. Yes? That guy accidentally improved 4 different lives. I laughed. Well, I still wouldn't send him a thank you card. Adrian grinned. Fair point. Across the yard, Sophie suddenly ran toward us with frosting all over her face. Look! She proudly held up a cupcake she had completely destroyed. Emily groaned. Oh no. Mark laughed. Too late. My mother grabbed her camera. This is adorable. Everyone started laughing again. And in that moment, standing in the middle of the loud, messy, joyful chaos, I realized something simple. Sometimes life doesn't fall apart. Sometimes it just breaks the wrong story. So the right one can begin. And that engagement party that once felt like a disaster ended up writing the best chapter of our lives. The end.